And hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. It is Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock on the East Coast, 4 o'clock on the West Coast. We're very excited to have a really fascinating show tonight about coronavirus and the origins of coronavirus. Hello to Noel Kassler, my partner in crime for the next while here on the Tuesday Night's Narrative. How are you, Noel? Welcome to the show.
I'm excellent, Zev. Happy to be here.
And we're going to have a great time. Nina Burleigh, by the way, who we know for many other reasons, will be here at around 7:30 in 30 minutes from now. And I say we know her for many other reasons because she's always on for, just being an incredible national journalist. But she's also the author of a new book about the coronavirus called Virus. And it is only out in May 18th, as it turns out. And she has a sneak peek of all of that for us tonight. So you'll hear about it first for what she found out in the book. And we also have a very exciting interview with a researcher, a scientist in Adelaide, who has been able to figure out something very special about the origins of coronavirus. And we'll get to that in just a minute. I want to make sure that we're streaming correctly. I can see that we are live on various feeds, but I wasn't quite sure if we were on the Narrative TV feed. So if we're not, someone yell at me or at Noel, and I'm sure we'll get it working if we don't have it right. And without further ado, then let me bring in Nick, who's joining us from Adelaide. Nick Petrovsky. Hi, Nick. How are you doing today? Oh, that was a very quick appearance. He just popped off there. He's on his cell phone signal, so we were expecting some difficulties. Not necessarily surprised by that, but hopefully he'll join us shortly. I will, in the meantime, tell you how we got to this point on the show, because it has been quite a journey. Last May, I published a story on Narrative, and did a show on Narrative where it's got one thing I got to do right here. Normally this works so well. Here we go. I want to make sure that you have your name, because it's important to have your name. There you are, Noel. Can you see that?
Nice.
Official co-host name. Let's try Nick one more time, see how he's doing as he just joins us. Nick, are you there?
Yes, Zeb, sorry about that. Obviously, the Australian network doesn't want me talking about this topic. So.
I was wondering about that. I'm sure a lot of people don't want you talking about this topic. You are, half the world away from us in Adelaide, where it's a terrific city, and it's 10 o'clock in the morning. And we thank you very much for joining us. Your work mostly is with developing vaccines. Is that correct?
Yeah, so for the last 20 years or so, I've been involved in developing mainly pandemic vaccines, so pandemic flu, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. So that's certainly what keeps us busy around here.
And you, like me, have been, I wouldn't say an outcast of the real world, but, last May when I published my story saying, hey, we really have to look at this lab theory a little bit more, people questioned me a lot. There was a lot of people out there saying, you're spreading a conspiracy theory. Why are you supporting something that Donald Trump said? And I said, look, these are the facts. These are what I see. This is what I understand as being the fact. And I'm presenting them as clearly as I can. But, it didn't go over well with too many people. And the same thing with the very important study that you did. Tell us a little bit about that reception.
Yeah, look, it's been a challenging 12 months for a whole lot of reasons. But, as a scientist, our role is just to look at the facts and put forward hypotheses and then test the hypotheses and disprove or prove them and then move on. And so it has been a very frustrating time because our research, innocently, which was originally designed around designing a vaccine against COVID-19, led us down a path which created more and more questions about the origins of this virus. We just couldn't explain our findings, in the sense of a normal zoonotic transmission from an animal to a human.
Absolutely.
And so we innocently thought the world will really want to hear this science because it's very solid science, and we just hit a brick wall. We couldn't get it accepted for publication through a range of journals. It was just being blocked, and it still hasn't officially been published to this day. We think we might be on the cusp of getting it accepted. 9 months after we submitted it. It's quite extraordinary, and it's a very innocent paper. It just models the virus and explains, that the virus was actually ideally optimal for binding to human receptors from from the first occurrence. And
we'll get into it in a bit. I don't want you to get ahead of us, but we're going to get to that in a second, because I know there's so much to explain around that. But, let's backtrack a little bit here and say, originally when the coronavirus broke out in Wuhan, the Chinese government or officials in China put out a story that said they believed it came from a market in Wuhan that sold live animals. It was called the Wuhan Sea Market, I think is the name that they use. And I'll show you a picture of it. Noel's still standing by, so we haven't lost him. And this is where, live animals are sold, often for meals that people make in China. But as it turns out, that wasn't necessarily the case. Researchers in China quickly discovered that most of the people who had contracted coronavirus in Wuhan, at least a significant number of them, hadn't even been near the Wuhan market. In fact, 14 of the 41st samples that they collected, none of them were even near the Wuhan market. So it sure is a possibility that it came from there, but it doesn't seem very likely to even researchers there. And the other thing that researchers pointed to, and this is Chinese researchers, once they've discovered that the Wuhan wet market was not a possibility, they said, well, look, there's at least 3 different places that are labs that treat coronaviruses. Some of them specialize in bat coronaviruses within 20 miles of that sea market. Maybe those places are places that we may want to look at as potential originators of this outbreak. And they included this Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is, amongst many other things, it's also the bat coronavirus center of all the world. There is no more important a place in the world for bat coronavirus study than the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's also the only high security CP4, I think they call it, or it's a level 4 lab that they have in China, which makes it, the place where they study all the most deadly diseases. And it's also a place that has this bat woman who is renowned. Shengli Ji is her name, and she's renowned for being a bat virologist that specializes only in coronavirus. And even though they had speculated this, the Chinese researchers, even though they'd put that out, there was a great insistence from the Chinese government that this wasn't the case. Now, Nick, you've done a lot of study into this. I mean, am I misleading anyone into saying that the wet market is likely, but not the most likely scenario?
Well, no. So, the Chinese CDC themselves dismissed the wet market as the source of the virus. So, that's we're getting it from source there. It's not our supposition.
Right.
Amongst the very earliest cases, there were a significant number that hadn't had contact with the wet market. And I think, in fact, the first case that they've identified similarly didn't have contact. So the wet market came into the picture a little bit later. It was actually a place where, the number of cases expanded, having got into the wet market. But it was almost certainly brought to the wet market by a human. And in fact, they did extensive screening of all the wet market and the animals in the wet market to find virus. And they found that, again, it appeared just to be human contamination. There was no evidence in the animals. So really, this whole wet market story was dismissed by the Chinese officially.
Oh, really? I didn't realize
that. I think now in the narrative, with the WHO report, they brought the wet market back into the story because they need another explanation. And so we now see the wet market almost brought back in 12 months after the Chinese themselves had dismissed it. And with no new evidence to implicate the wet market. But really, they need a source for the virus, because if it isn't the wet market, it isn't an animal source, then you're left with the inevitable conclusion, maybe it came out of the lab.
Right. Now, there was this animal. I wish I had a picture, because I may have loaded the wrong deck, but I'll show people in a second the right deck. There's an animal called the pangolin, which you probably have never heard of. I never did until I looked it up when I first came across it. It isn't even sold in the wet market. But originally, that's the theory that they had put out. They said the pangolin was the intermediary between the bat coronavirus, which they had originally discovered at the in 11,000 miles away, as it turns out. But they had originally discovered this coronavirus relative in Yunnan, 11,000 miles away. But then they suspected that this pangolin may have been the intermediary between the bats and the human beings, even though it was 11,000 miles away. Now, that is still a possibility, right? The pangolin as an intermediary is a possibility, even though they didn't really sell it at the Wuhan wet market.
So look, the pangolin story was an interesting one because, again, it got into the news because of a complete scientific miscommunication. So a team in China had identified a coronavirus in pangolins and announced to the world they had found the source of COVID-19.
Right.
Thinking they'd found COVID-19 in their pangolins. They hadn't. It turned out it was a miscommunication between the two Chinese teams, the one sequencing the virus and the one making the announcement, which were two different institutes. And it turned out when, in fact, they went back and looked at the sequence of the pangolin coronavirus, it had nothing in common with COVID-19. It was only about 90% similar, which is a million miles away in effect in viral terms.
Really? That's interesting.
But by then the world's media had run the story, the COVID-19 has been found in pangolins. Pangolins are the missing link. As I say, that was all completely erroneous and was all retracted. But the pangolin, the poor animal, has sort of stayed centre stage. People have looked increasingly, obviously, at pangolins. The Chinese government have done screening in pangolins. Certainly, pangolins do have their own coronavirus, but it isn't the source of COVID-19. And there's no evidence that pangolins anywhere in the world are currently the source of COVID-19. So, yes, pangolins are there in the spotlight, falsely implicated, probably innocent. There are not a lot of pangolins around, so the probability of a pangolin being the transmission vehicle, as you said, is incredibly remote, because usually you would need a lot of infected animals interacting with humans to have a chance of a virus crossing over. And that's simply, there are only a couple of pangolins being smuggled into China each year. It's such a remote possibility. That it's hard to postulate.
In fact, there aren't any animals right now that people consider are the likely intermediary, as far as they can tell. I mean, they've sort of done studies on everything, and there's very little to suggest that any animal is the direct intermediary between the bat and the human beings. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think the important thing is people speculated very early, could this have come straight across from a bat? And I think the definitive answer, based on our research and others, is absolutely not. The closest bat virus, rat G13, doesn't infect human cells. So there's really no possibility of this having come straight from a bat to a human. So if you want to postulate an animal source, you have to find this intermediary, species that harbored the virus and allowed it to cross over. The Chinese themselves, not surprisingly, they've done a phenomenal job in screening every conceivable animal in China. And I think in the WHO report, they actually cite about, 10,000 samples that were analysed by the Chinese, and it came up with zero evidence of any animal carrying anything like COVID-19. So the Chinese themselves have come up with a complete blank when it comes to finding this sort of mystical animal that supposedly carried this virus into humans.
So there's no animal intermediary that we can find. I want to play a clip from Redfield, the CDC director under Trump, in a second. But Noel, do you have any questions or any comments you want to throw in here?
No, it's just fascinating. I just want to listen and learn.
Okay. So let's listen to what Redfield said this is the former CDC director, the head guy of the CDC, and he was talking on a special on CNN. This is Sanjay Gupta's special, and he shocked everyone. He shocked me because he actually said what I believed is the theory. But because he's the former CDC director under Trump, everyone sort of poo-pooed him and said, well, you're just another conspiracy theorist. So here then is what he said, and we'll analyze it on the other side of this. And just so you know, you guys are still on camera while we're playing this. So, and I have to find it because it's here. Here it is. Here we go.
If I was to guess, this virus started transmitting somewhere in September, October in Wuhan.
September, October.
That's my own view. It's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions now. I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. Escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
It is also not unusual for that type of research to be occurring in Wuhan. The city is a widely known center for viral studies in China, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has experimented extensively with bat coronaviruses.
It is a remarkable conversation I feel like we're having here, because you are the former CDC director and you were the director at the time this was all happening.
For the first time, the former CDC director is stating publicly that he believes this pandemic started months earlier than we knew, and that it originated not at a wet market, but inside a lab in China.
These are two significant things to say, Dr. Redfield.
That's not implying any intentionality. It's my opinion, right? But I am a virologist. I have spent my life in virology. I do not believe this somehow came from a bat to a human, and at that moment in time, the virus that came to the human became one of the most infectious viruses that we know in humanity.
So that's a significant point he's making there, isn't there? I mean, that it took to humans really well, and it took to humans very quickly. Nick, yeah.
Look, that was the outcome of our research, and we did molecular modelling on all the different species of animals that had been put forward. This is going back to February, March last year, when no one knew anything about this virus. And we were looking for this mystical, intermediary host back then, and that was the purpose of our research. We really believed, like everyone, that's how this came about. And so what we were able to do is we were modelling all of the different species of animals to work out which one was the virus actually optimally designed to infect, because that should be the original host. And to our surprise, what came out of the study was that, in fact, it was optimally designed to infect and transmit between humans. And every other animal species was below humans. So it suggested this had been in humans all along. And of course, we then looked to see, is there any evidence this virus was circulating in humans for the last few years? And we simply didn't know about it. And the answer is, and again, the Chinese have done very extensive surveys, there is no evidence this virus was in humans prior to, October, November, December 2019. So then we started looking, well, how could this be optimally evolved for humans if it's never seen a human? Mm-hmm. And of course, the only plausible answer is it saw human cells in a laboratory. And so it became adapted to humans. It didn't actually have to be in a whole human. Nowadays, it's very common to culture viruses with human cells. And in that way, the virus actually learns and becomes very good at infecting humans. And if that virus then leaked and infected a laboratory worker who was handling those cultures, well, that would explain exactly what Robert Redfield is describing, an accidental leak, non-intentional, of a laboratory that was doing research on these viruses. And we know that the institutes in Wuhan were the leading world, investigators into these types of viruses.
So just to underline there, because there's so much there. The first thing you said is that this human-to-human transmission, or this bat-to-human transmission, is best adapted for humans, and that means that the receptor for this virus is only really. Can you say that again? Because I'm going to say it correctly. But basically, you're saying it's the most adapted to human beings.
Yeah. So the receptor for this virus is a protein on the surface of cells, which we call angiotensin converting enzyme.
This is a cell.
yeah. So the
I've got
cells
something on here.
So the cells in your nose express a protein called ACE2, or angiotensin converting enzyme 2.
Okay.
That plays a role in normal function of the cells, but it's the protein the virus uses to attach to those cells and invade them.
So there's something
Now,
attached to my cell over here that would have a spike or something sort of receptor at least that would allow
that
would allow the
from your cell that
Yeah.
the virus recognizes.
Right.
When that virus recognizes that ACE2 protein in your nose, it says, right, it's time to invade these cells.
Right.
If it doesn't see ACE2, then the virus doesn't infect you. So, for instance, we know in mice, they express an ACE2 protein, but their ACE2 protein is quite different to humans, and it's not recognized by the virus. And so the virus actually won't infect mice.
So the coronavirus is specifically adaptable to human beings.
To our protein.
Our protein.
Our ACE2 protein.
Right.
So it's exquisitely, able to bind and infect cells that express that protein. But even small changes to that protein in other species, the virus doesn't recognize them nearly as well, and so it doesn't invade them. So you can put as much virus as you like into a mouse, and it doesn't get sick.
But you do get dogs and other animals that do get sick from coronavirus, don't they?
So they can get infected, and again, this is what our data showed, is we could rank all the species. So they're the species like humans, the virus is perfectly adapted to. There are a group of species in the middle, and this in fact includes cats and dogs and ferrets and minks. And so the virus is able to infect them. It's not going to make them terribly sick because, again, it's not specifically adapted to them, but it'll infect them. And then you have animals at the bottom, which include snakes and mice, where it doesn't matter how much virus you load into those animals, it simply won't cause them to get infected or to get ill. So you have this gradation of infectivity and also seriousness of infection. And humans are right at the top of that pyramid, and that is not what we would expect from a normal transmission that's occurred from an animal to a human. Okay. It takes time for the virus to build that strength in the new host. So in this case, it already had that strength.
Almost impossible for this to have happened any other way except in a lab.
Well, again, not impossible. Science is just about, exploring all possibilities. Right. And so those of us who suspect that, the evidence is on the side of this, coming from a laboratory would never say it's impossible that it came from nature. Maybe we just haven't found that missing link yet. Obviously, the more we look and we don't find it, the more likely the other scenario, which is it's from a lab. But we certainly can never say with 100% certainty it came from a lab unless someone in that lab actually says, it was me. I made the mistake. I'm sorry for that. The likelihood, of course, as we go further into this, of someone or some organization taking responsibility is exceedingly low. And you can understand why. I mean, even if it happened in the US or somewhere else, I mean, it takes a very strong discipline to admit to causing a global pandemic.
Absolutely.
Even if they were aware of it, you wouldn't expect them to volunteer that at this time.
It was also possible, right, that it could be a natural transmission from an animal to a human in a lab. In other words, it doesn't have to be that anything was weirdly done with the virus in order for that to happen. It could happen in a lab setting, maybe an experiment, but not necessarily because anything was manipulated or engineered or anything.
Absolutely. And again, that's why we were so surprised we got such a pushback on our paper. Because in our paper, we didn't, put forward when we were looking at the scenarios, and they were just scenarios. Again, we weren't claiming we knew anything about the origins of the virus. But we said, look, if if this did happen in a lab, it's most likely that it was just someone was culturing this virus in the lab, and then they accidentally, got a flick of liquid in their eye, which we know can happen, and that's sufficient to trigger the first human infection. And so we weren't saying that someone had genetically modified the virus or that it was a bioweapon. I mean, all these other, obviously much more extreme interpretations for which there's absolutely no evidence. We were saying this was just an honest mistake that could happen to anyone, any place, that triggered, the transmission of this virus from a Petri dish, most likely, or from an animal, as you say, that was being infected in the lab, to one of the people who were looking after it, and from there. And again, very innocent, not suggesting any culpability even. This has happened before. We know with SARS that, SARS got out of Chinese labs a number of times and caused some outbreaks after the original epidemic. Again, these things happen. And so no one's trying to point a finger, but it's important, if that is the reason and the origin, it's important we know about it.
Yeah, it might also help us treat the disease, right? You'll have much more relevant information then, presumably.
Well, I mean, maybe it won't help us treat, knowing the origin won't help us treat it, but certainly it will help us to think about how do we prevent another occurrence of the same thing.
Right. You may not want to mention people, and I understand why, but I might, if you don't mind, because when this story first came to my attention, when I was reading two articles, one was in Scientific American and one was in CNN Health, by two people involved in the story. One of them was the bat woman who runs the bat virology research, and that's what she's known as, at Wuhan Institute of Virology. And the other person was Peter Daszak, who you may have seen on TV a few times. He's the guy who basically helps fund Zheng Lixi's research. He takes grants from the US government and brings it through his organization called EcoHealth and distributes it around the world to various research facilities who do all this kind of interesting pandemic work. Now, what struck me when I was reading these two stories is they had different takes on what happened. She said she was in Shanghai, had to fly quickly back to Wuhan to do a test of the genetic sequence that she got from Wuhan of the actual coronavirus and compare it to all the indexed bat coronavirus that she had in her database. Now, in this article, and maybe incorrect, maybe the article or the journalist got it wrong, but she said that none of the sequences matched those of the viruses that her team had sampled from the bat caves, which isn't in fact the case, because we know there were 8 actual coronaviruses there at the Wuhan Institute of Virology that did match the sample from Wuhan. So Peter Daszak, who funded Xi's work, but has also spent more than a decade, I think, maybe even 15 years or longer, visiting Wuhan, and he knows the facility pretty well, he said to CNN that the new coronavirus did match something from their database. In fact, it matched a horseshoe bat that was found in a cave in Yunnan, 11,000 miles away, again, in 2013. And it was 96.2% identical. And I don't have it here, but there's a video clip where I think he actually personally found that bat in Yunnan when he was doing research, and he's the one who collected the sample. So he would know about this 2013 find of this horseshoe bat and how similar it is now to the coronavirus. So this tweaked me a little bit and said, well, there's something unusual going on here. At least maybe the journalist got it wrong, but it could be that they're not telling us the truth. Can you explain to us a little bit more about how important that facility is and how they justify their bat coronavirus database in terms of what help it might give to people to stopping this future pandemics?
So I think I need to correct that Zheng Lixi actually didn't say that there was no match. What she said is she'd had sleepless nights worrying that, in fact, the virus had come out of her lab, which is very telling in itself. It says that she was aware they were doing research that could have resulted in a lab leak, which they've subsequently denied doing any such research. But, again, you can't explain her saying, I had sleepless nights until I confirmed that, this virus hadn't come out of my lab. So I think, she was quite honest in telling us that. No, what she did say that, when, you have to realize there's a perfect match and a closely related virus. What she was saying is that she didn't find a perfect match for COVID-19, which would mean that, in fact, the virus had come from her lab, because then she would have the virus in her lab that was COVID-19.
Right, so she felt relieved that it wasn't the actual virus.
So she was relieved, and so what she was trying to say is, I was relieved there wasn't a perfect match.
Right.
But then subsequently said, but we found a virus which we also found, from bats, which is the closest match. And in fact, that was then a very high-profile publication saying, the rat G13 virus, which Peter Daszak is now referring to, was genetically the most closely related virus to COVID-19, which then said, oh, well, maybe this virus came from bats. Without that, there was no real handle on where did this virus come from.
Now, in fact, this rat 13, say it again, there's another part of it I'm missing. It's the rat something 13, right?
Rat G13.
Rat G13. This is an unusual thing. It doesn't, the amount of coronaviruses in the world number what, in the millions? Probably, I don't know.
Well, certainly, we've characterized thousands.
Right.
But yes, there's a lot more out there, obviously. That
from various animals, various diseases that we are not aware of, never even thought of, but maybe there's a million types of coronaviruses out there. Now, what are the chances are that a big pandemic are going to come from bats or bat coronaviruses? I mean, how big are these bat coronavirus universe?
Well, so bat coronaviruses are, restricted to certain parts of Asia, particularly China, Thailand, Malaysia, where a lot of these bats live that carry the coronaviruses, but not every bat carries a coronavirus. Right. So they tend to occur in clusters. And again, although there might be thousands or 100,000s of variants, they all cluster into families. So we have the SARS coronavirus family, which caused the SARS outbreak, but it's a whole collection of different viruses that are all very closely related. We now have the SARS-CoV-2 related family, into which, you could possibly put rat G13 and a number of other viruses that have been identified that are close enough relatives that you would put them in the same. So there's a restricted number of types of bat coronavirus. It's not like there's millions. There's 3 or 4 families to which these coronaviruses are related. So it's not
many genomes
nearly as complex as it might first look.
How many genomes do you think we're talking about then? Like, is it sequences? Could it be well, a million? Could it be 1,000? Could it be? Or am I just reaching for a number that we don't know?
I think that we know before the Wuhan Institute of Virology took all of their...
Oops. He'll be back, I hope, because there was quite a cliffhanger. Well, he's fascinating, Noel, but it gives us a good opportunity to bring in, if she's ready, I hope she is, because I know she was busy, Nina. Let's see if we can bring her in, and then we can have a four-way conversation. Hey, Nina, you've been listening to the conversation going on up until now. What are we should tell people that you've just published or about to publish a book called Virus that's out on May 18th. And we'll get to talking to that about that in a minute. But you've been listening to the conversation. I'll get your thoughts in a minute. Here's Peter. Here's Nick again. Sorry about all that. Nick's back. Nick, tell us a little bit more about, I was trying to nail you on a number, but maybe that doesn't exist, about the number of bat viruses out there, bat coronaviruses. Well,
yes, it's certainly in the thousands, and a lot of these bat viruses were all in a database in the Wuhan Institute of Virology that was available to the public until late in 2019, and suddenly at the same time this outbreak started, all of those databases were removed. and
That's
made
unusual.
secret, and they've refused to make those sequences in those databases available since, which has obviously disappointed a lot of virologists because they believe that there may be information in those databases that would help them to work out where COVID-19 did come from. And so, it's again, doesn't look good when you say this is an innocent database of bat coronaviruses, but we're not going to show anyone what's actually in them.
Right.
The question is, what are you hiding?
And what's the likelihood that a pandemic breaks out and the coronavirus that it's most closely related to is, within 20 miles of that event, or that so-called center of that event? I mean, it seems like, you've got these millions or plenty of coronaviruses in the world. This one particular place is studying bats, and they're studying bat coronaviruses, and even amongst the thousands of bat coronaviruses, they happen to have the one that was closest related to the one that broke out within their vicinity. I mean, it seems to make sense that that's something you'd want to look at.
Absolutely. And I think, everyone had the same sense that, even the fact that the virus they've identified from bats that's the closest came from several thousand kilometers away. So where the institute is not actually where the bat viruses are. The only reason they're bat viruses in Wuhan is they're stored in the laboratory at the institute. And so, again, even the Chinese expected, like SARS, that if they were going to get an outbreak of coronaviruses, it would occur in southern China, where they know they're bats that carry these types of viruses. No one was expecting this to occur in Wuhan, and you have to ask, well, why was it Wuhan, as you say? And again, it's an innocent question. The only sort of explanation that links Wuhan to these viruses is the institute. And so I don't think, again, it's finger pointing to ask the innocent question, is that the explanation why this outbreak started in Wuhan, which is not where even the Chinese were expecting an outbreak to occur.
And he has a map, by the way. If people want to know where Yunnan is, I think I'm saying it correctly, but who knows? That's where the virus was found in a bat. It's a long way away from Wuhan. It's 11,000 miles away. So really, if it had traveled, it would have meant a bat had to, either fly there, which I don't think they do, or contaminate an animal in the actual zone, and then that animal would have got to Wuhan somehow, or a human. I mean, it seems quite difficult for that to have happened. Is that true?
Absolutely, and again, viruses leave traces. So even if you postulate a virus has traveled across country, whether it's in a human or in an animal, it would leave a trace. In other words, people would get infected along the journey. If someone, got on a train from Yunnan, went to Wuhan, they'd infect people at the Yunnan train station, people who were on the same train who went to Beijing. And so then you would have multiple outbreaks of the virus, all about the same time. But here we just had a singular outbreak in Wuhan that clearly then spread to the rest of China. But there's no evidence of an outbreak before Wuhan. And I know the Chinese early on, they were putting out stories about Italy and the US and, India and every other country saying, the virus started there. But there is absolutely no credible scientific evidence that this virus was anywhere other than Wuhan in October, November, 2019. It started in Wuhan, and there's absolutely no evidence it came from somewhere else.
Nina Burleigh is writing an incredible book, and I'll show you the cover in just a few minutes, but has written a book called Virus, and it's about the coronavirus, and it's out on May 18th. She's joining us tonight, as she often does. Nina, do you have any questions or comments as you've been listening to what we've been discussing so far? Oh, your microphone is not on. I wonder if you're on mute. No, I still can't hear you. Maybe it's this. Maybe you could reconnect it somehow. Let me try that. Does that work? Say something? No, still not. You might have to reconnect. Unless you're, oh, wait, say something? No, I don't think so. I cannot hear you. And I've tried a few times. So let me try maybe this, see if that works. Does that work at all? Can you hear me? No, I don't think so. We'll get back to Nina in just a second. Noel, do you have any questions for Nick while we're here?
It's just fascinating, Nick, and we'll let Nina talk about this. But from everything you've said, it sounds like it had to originate, in a lab. And I like how you said, it didn't have to be nefarious. It could have just been, accidentally transmitted. But when you look at how the virus behaved once it got out there in the world, how doctors had never seen like lung x-rays that looked like ground glass and people's blood was coagulating, and all the horrificness with which it spread through the world speaks to the fact that it was engineered, besides what you said about the ACE2 enzymes and all that, which backs up the theory of it being engineered. I guess my question is, it sounds like your paper is correct, and Nina talks about this. I had a chance to peek at her book, and it's brilliant. I'm going to tell everybody to read it when it comes out. But, it's a dangerous truth for science to have the truth now come out, it seems like. It's not just the Chinese would want to hide it. It seems like most of the scientific community wouldn't want this truth to be known at this point.
Look, I think, that's unfortunately true, that, the virology community, who do research on viruses are extremely concerned about the backlash that would come if it's revealed this pandemic did actually come out of a laboratory. I mean, if that was established, world governments would be looking very carefully at what virus research do we allow? What virus research do we ban? That's going to have an impact on virologists all over the world. And so not surprisingly, they're quite terrified of that whole lab origin narrative and have very strongly pushed back at it, saying, well, if unless there's absolute irrefutable evidence, we don't want to hear it even mentioned as a hypothesis. Right. Because, people might start making inferences from that and might start, regulating our research just based on the supposition. And so their view is, but of course, my view is if we can't discuss it, we'll never get to the bottom of the truth. And maybe it was a lab leak. And if it was, we need to know that. But if we don't ask the question, we're never going to find the answer. And so, yes, virologists as a group have been one of the strongest sort of, dismissers of the lab hypothesis because they have a vested interest in virology research, which is understandable, but problematic for those of us who just want to get to the bottom of the truth. And as I say, none of us really know the answer. There's a lot of evidence it may have come from a lab, and some people have gone as far as to say, like Robert Redfield, our conclusion is that, but overall, we don't have any evidence for it coming from nature. So really we have an open question that needs to be addressed. And we need to be open-minded and explore all possibilities, even the unpalatable ones. And yes, it's unpalatable for a lot of people, including me, if it did come from a lab. But if it did, we need to know it.
Nina, why don't you jump in here with any thoughts or questions? And this, by the way, is the book cover of Nina's new book that comes out in May called Virus, which is available right now as a pre-order. Go ahead, Nina.
Yeah, thank you, Noel, for saying that. And also, Dr. Petrosky, thank you for your in very, very enlightening explanation of what's going on. I got into this because I'm writing these essays about really to try to explain and cut through the fog of what we just went through. So part of the book is about the almost criminal Trump regime response to it in the way the public policy, the handling of it in the United States, and then the amazing triumph of science in creating this vaccine in a year, and the we discount the advances of science, and so I come to this as a big fan of science. And there's a chapter or an essay about the crazy conspiracy theories that sort of erupted around COVID, right? COVID hoax, it's just the flu. And if you went on Reddit, you would see, oh, it's the Kung flu, and Bill Gates is behind it, and it's a population control, it's a population control virus, and which is so ridiculous because Bill Gates has vaccinated millions of African children and actually had the opposite effect on the population than what they're saying he's going to have. But then I got to the lab leak theory, and I didn't know as much about it. I read Nicholson Baker's article, and I thought, this sounds interesting. And then I got more involved, and I interviewed Dr. David Relman at Stanford, who you may know is a microbiologist and who is open, one of the few American, top level scientists in America, virologist, or who is talking about this. And I think what happened was, under Trump, I just should call him the last guy. Under the last guy, you couldn't talk about these things because we had this issue with their xenophobic lunacy, and also because they were pushing all these conspiracy theories, including COVID as a hoax, and QAnon was erupting. And so nobody really wanted to get on board. But once you started to look into it, yes, you're whatever, all of the things that you've said, there were other researchers who were talking about that quite early on, and they were immediately silenced. And I don't know, when Redfield says science will figure it out, honestly, I think it'll be one of those things where 100 years from now, they'll still be saying, it was probably a lab leak. But the scientists are never going to admit. Would you admit if something escaped from your lab that killed millions of people? There's never going to admit it. So I don't understand. I'm not sure that we're ever going to get to the bottom of it. I did think it was interesting in mid-March, one of those WHO team members, just a tiny blip on NBC. I think I sent it to you, Zev, a minute or two ago. A little tiny story. One of the members of the team says to NBC, yeah, we know that some of those Wuhan virologists were sick in the fall. And then you never saw anything about that story again. I've been looking for it because that's what, there's the smoking gun, right? They got sick.
In fact, they denied that they were sick. Especially in the WHO report, they denied that there was any sickness at the Institute of Virology.
Now it's obliterated. So it's up to the science community, I guess, to come around and we don't. I mean, science is so advanced. Again, I've just I can't, the vaccine and this genetic platform that they've come up with. The fact that within 200 years ago, humans were utterly helpless against every single kind of infectious disease, literally helpless, except for the smallpox vaccine. And then at the beginning of the 19th or 20th century, the lifespan of Americans was 48 and 49, the average lifespan. And now it's 78 and 79. Why? Because of vaccinations, childhood vaccinations. If you were born in 1900, you would have never gotten to be 20 or 25 years old without knowing a sibling or another child who died or who had absolutely traumatic illnesses, the names of which we can't even pronounce. And we are so spoiled by these vaccines that we can walk around. We have half the country going, you think you know better than I do? I'll just DIY it on the internet. I don't think I'm going to vaccinate my kid for measles. I'm not going to take the COVID. We know EMTs up here and nursing home staff who have said no, they don't want it. So we know better than the experts is part of sort of the current cultural moment. But there is another reason why people are suspicious, and it has to do with, we know, anybody who grew up in the baby boom or Gen X and was even half paying attention to the culture, that there was a lot of bad science done by our own scientists, and it's all secret. They were doing bioweapons research at Fort Detrick. They had all sorts of, one of the Nicholson Baker FOIAs has to do with this wheat killing disease that our American scientists were working on so they could drop it on the Soviets and starve the army. And instead it got loose and they had 20 Midwestern states lost their crops for 2 years. This is all forgotten history from the 1950s. MK Ultra, LSD experiments. Scott Olson was at Fort Detrick. Scott Olson was working on Korean, germ warfare, and so we know that was something that the American scientists were working on, and I think that is really the bottom, at the foundation of like this kind of QAnon mania, because people know about it. And so here we are with this worldwide, and it's just so bad for science that they've done so many great things that they can't, and I don't know what the answer is. I'm not in your profession, but I think like David Relman at Stanford, if more people would come out and say, it's quite possible that this is an accident, then they have to, they would have to come back and make some changes, I suppose, because it's incredibly, and we're lucky, as Zeynep Tufek chief says, this is a starter pandemic. It could have been much worse. It could be 50% fatal.
Nick, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I totally agree. And I think what people fail to see is that, we shouldn't stop the science, even at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, but what we have to recognize the risks. And we can't have the research occurring under a regime where they hid the truth from the world, if we're being totally frank about this, of the original outbreak. And even the WHO have come out and admitted that to an extent they were deceived by the Chinese in terms of the seriousness of this outbreak back in December and early January. They were told there was no person-to-person transmission. We now have doctors in Wuhan saying we were telling the authorities, in mid-December, this was clearly human-to-human transmission, a respiratory virus. They should be shutting everything down. That narrative didn't get out to the rest of the world. It was shut down by the Chinese authorities. We have a pandemic now, not because we had the Wuhan Institute of Virology during research or even that they had a lab leak, but an environment where they had a lab leak and then they tried to hide it. And that's where the real problem starts, is not that you might have a lab leak, but if you then hide the outbreak from the world, and also internally in China, long enough for that virus to spread and get out, then you are responsible for the pandemic. So it's not the laboratory error, I believe, if that's what triggered this, that really is at fault. It was the environment of the suppression of the doctors who were trying to warn the world from China in December, look, this is another SARS, you've got to shut everything down. And that didn't happen, and that is inexcusable.
That's very true. And of course, the cover-up may be continuing today, because as we found out from the World Health Organization investigation, when the investigators were sent over there for a visit, we assumed, or at least I assumed, it was going to be one of these investigations where they could look at everything. They'd certainly have access to all the facilities or any research or anything. That's not really the way it was designed. As it turns out, they were given a framework that they could work within. And in fact, it was a investigation that is now at least being referred to as a joint investigation between China and the World Health Organization. It wasn't just an independent World Health Organization investigation. And in fact, the Chinese and the WHO, the regime in China and the WHO, had come up with a certain list of research and certain list of criteria that these investigators had to work within. So even if they wanted to, they couldn't really do everything they needed to do in terms of exploring what they needed to in terms of the Wuhan outbreak. But then there's, ultimately, they did get a chance to at least consider whether it was a virus that came out of a lab. And so this is, the four outcomes that they come out with are: there's a direct zoonotic spillover is considered to be a possible to likely pathway. And then introduction through an intermediate host is considered to be likely to a very likely pathway. an introduction through cold food chain products, which is basically that frozen food somehow infected people in Wuhan, and that food became the origin of the outbreak. They consider that still a possible pathway. And then the last thing they say is introduction through laboratory incident, which is what we're discussing here today, was considered to be extremely unlikely. However, when you actually look at the fine print of what they were able to do, what they said they were able to investigate, is they said that they did, in fact, the SARS-CoV-2 is introduced through a laboratory incident. This is a low incidence of why they say it's not likely, reflecting an accidental infection of a staff from laboratory activities involving the relevant virus. Now, they do not consider that hypothesis of deliberate release or deliberate bioengineering of SARS-CoV-2 for the release. So just to paraphrase that a little bit, they said basically that the laboratory incident as a accident was possible but not likely, and then a deliberate release they didn't think was likely, but a deliberate bioengineering is still possible because they never even studied that. So what are your thoughts about the WHO investigation as a whole, and how they conducted the investigation with China, and whether these results actually reflect the reality of what might be the case?
So I think, Zev, we have to realize that this was a goodwill mission. I mean, calling it, even the group who went into China have now said, don't call this an investigation. So this was a goodwill mission trying to establish ties, between WHO and China. And the agreed mission was for this group, a panel of experts, to review the Chinese data. So in other words, the data that the Chinese had collected, this group was to review that data and comment on it.
Right.
It wasn't to go anywhere outside of that and start asking their own questions or investigating their own hypotheses. So it was never an investigation. And in fact, today, I notice most of the Western world governments have put out an official statement. This is a collective of the US, Australian, Canadian, and a number of the UK, European countries have put out an official statement saying that they are seriously concerned with the WHO report. And I'm reassured that not everyone is falling for this narrative that this was an independent investigation that was going to go in and have access to everything and come to a conclusive decision. It was, as I say, a goodwill joint mission between WHO and China, where 50% of the members of the panel were Chinese. They had a right to veto of any decisions. Obviously had a very strong voice in what was in the narrative that was in that report. And now we have most Western governments saying, don't take that report verbatim as if it was an independent report that was really empowered to go to the bottom of where did this virus come from. And I think it's very reassuring that that statement has been put out.
And this is after the United States actually, I think, made them rewrite it. If you listen carefully to what the White House said yesterday in the press conference, they said that they were encouraged that the report had been rewritten. So presumably it was even, more elusive about, or not elusive, more, supportive of the Chinese findings than it now reads. But even now, it's kind of disturbing. I mean, you've got, besides the fact that they've added in all these elements to say it's a joint WHO-China study and it says joint report and then acknowledges them, it doesn't seem to recognize all the possibilities and rank them very fairly. And then what I also found kind of interesting, we mentioned the two people earlier, Peter Daszak and Zhenji Shi, I think. Look, he was on the committee that went there for the WHO. He was the only American representative who went on this investigative trip to Wuhan and China. And she is the person who was handling all the pathogen identification, which makes sense because she's such a prominent person. But, there also need to be looked at in a very different light, considering he funded the facility. And Zhenji Qi was the person in charge of the research.
Yes, look, I mean, that's certainly an issue of independence. And not only is Peter obviously not independent and has major conflicts, but he's been extremely vocal, in fact, voicing the opinion for the whole panel even before the official report was made public, he was commenting, this is what I'm going to say in the report, clearly indicating he was the dominant voice of the Western members of this panel, which, is even more inappropriate. It's inappropriate to have someone who's conflicted and not independent. It's even more inappropriate when you allow that person to actually control the decision making and the wording of what's released out of that report. It's really disappointing, I think, in that context.
Absolutely. Do you have time to stay on? I just haven't checked with either of you. You've got time. Do you have any time for a little bit longer with us, Nick or Nina?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's no problem, Zev.
Okay. Because I did
want to hear what Nina says.
Yeah.
So.
Nina, I'd be interested to let's just turn it over to you, Nina. But I also afterwards want to play you a little bit of what Peter Daszak has been saying to 60 Minutes over the years, which is also really fascinating, and how his funding got stopped and then restarted by the Trump administration. But Nina, why don't you jump in if you have any comments or questions?
Well, I was just going to comment that, and you've alluded to it, that money that he was putting into, that Daszak was putting into the Wuhan system was American government money. I mean, he was getting Pentagon funding or DTRA funding. What is it called? Defense Threat Reduction Agency. And, it's all very murky stuff. And he had been, I know, soliciting money from private donors in New York for a while, but he also had this thing going on with the pipeline with the U.S. government that was putting money into, the Bat Cave in China. I mean, he was working with her. The thing I wanted to ask Nick is whether or not I read, and I don't know if this is something that you looked into, that the Chinese, that Xi Jinping actually had that institute had the largest database on bat coronaviruses in the world, and that database was taken down. I think Nicholson Baker reports this. It was taken down like right after the pandemic really started to fly around.
Nick mentioned that earlier, yeah.
And did he mention it? Sorry, I missed that. Yeah, and I mean what could be more suspicious than that? Oh, it's a national security issue for the Chinese. So I don't know. I mean, my only other comment would be, look, again, I write about government policy and, global affairs here. If the Chinese government is forced to admit that they did, that this happened, you have to imagine that their government will collapse. The Chinese people will not. I mean, it's asking for a real, and that is an autocratic country government, and I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, my sources in Washington who are who work in this sort of intelligence community are very concerned that to have to admit this really puts the U.S. also in a very tricky position, because we're kind of, especially if it was some kind of a bioweapon, which, of course, the Bannon jumped on that right away. That's another reason why everybody was like, no, it's not a bioweapon. It was an accident. Let's just put the benign spin on it. It's an accident. But, our own, again, going back to our own secret bioweapons programs, many scientists worked on bioweapons in Fort Detrick, thousands, during the Cold War. The Cold War ended, and that program was reduced. 9/11 happened, and what happened? They started throwing millions and millions and millions of dollars into more bioweapon defense research. Okay, so these bioweapon defense research included, again, whenever you have these tsunamis of defense money, it goes into all of these murky places, and is this time up? I don't want to.
Yeah, he'll show up. He's got time. He's just
it's right after 9/11. I mean, somebody got rich scamming off anthrax vaccines, like millions and millions of anthrax vaccines. So, but let me just finish. But basically, this country ramped up. Under NIH and under NIAID, they were ramping up this biodefense project, because after 9/11, national security oceans of money were flowing in, and that project, that kind of a project, was destabilizes the world balance in terms of defense. So maybe the Chinese were starting to do their own bio defense experiments. We know the Japanese were, and I mean,
they've
if
been
you
doing it all for centuries. I mean,
and if
go
you
back to the
read,
Opium Wars, and you know that
yeah,
this has been a factor in Chinese history all along. But more than just being a factor in Chinese history, this has been part of their defense strategy, and spoken about and written about defense strategy of the Chinese for a long time now. That bioengineering is part of their warfare program. So it's not unthinkable that they were somehow developing a bioweapon. And in fact, we know that the Obama administration were the ones to freeze the funding on Zheng Jieqi when she was in 2015, and it was the Trump. They froze it all.
They were freezing that gain of function stuff.
Right, exactly.
That's what they did, because there is not agreement in the virology world, and Nick can probably talk to this. There is not agreement that that's such a great thing, that they should be doing that in the labs. Many scientists think that's not a good idea, and it's not making us safer. And so somebody got the Obama administration regime's ear, and they said, yeah, let's stop that. And there were people here who were complaining about it. Ralph Barrick in North Carolina, a very prominent gain of function experimenter, still on the record, hey, it's a great thing. You just stopped these great experiments. Meanwhile, they have refrigerators full of vials of these viruses that, as you've described this one, it's been taught to like human flesh or human cells. And we really are living in a very strange world. And it's, again, science advances. I hail them in my book. And I think that, we don't think about them enough and appreciate them enough for the way they've changed our society and our life and our lifespans. But this stuff is, it's due for a reckoning and a rethinking before it really gets out of control. And I don't know if there's anybody having that conversation. I mean, at least people are talking about it a little bit more. But
certainly, if they restarted the funding, they should. Because I think in 2019 they did restart the funding, and maybe it wasn't specifically so that was under Trump that they decided. Even though in 2015 they determined that that this was dangerous to the world, it could start a pandemic. In 2019 they decided to restart it under Trump, and then a year later he decides to pull out all the facilities we had there to detect pandemic research and to respond to pandemic research, which is also just another, can of worms to open up. Noel, I've been speaking a lot, and Nina and Nick haven't. I'm sorry, haven't had a chance to let you in here, but what are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
I mean, my head feels like it's going to explode, and it's an important show. And Nina just laid it out. Like, we have to have this conversation, and her book is fascinating. Like, I'm going to buy a copy for everybody I know, because it's really like, I got a sneak peek at it, Nina. And it's like, if people think this is going to be like a weighty science thing, it's not. Like, the facts are in there and you're going to learn a ton, but it reads like a thriller. You're just like, you literally can't put it down. I started it in 2 places and was jumping through, because you're like, oh my God, because this was almost the perfect storm of so many things. And Nina lays it out in her book, the ignorance that Trump had cultivated and exploited in this country made the COVID virus that much more effective, because people wouldn't wear masks, they won't get vaccinated now. So it was almost the perfect virus at the perfect time in history. It was like a modern plague, because we have a dark age mentality and high-tech bio warfare, if it is that, or bioengineering. And the confluence of those two things can't be overlooked, and it can't be ignored. And if it is ignored, it'll be at our peril. And we've just gotten a taste this year of that, and it's been horrific. But this could be just the beginning, So it's terrifying and important stuff. And I'll say one more thing.
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
And also, having this discussion, just because what's going on in our country right now, is no way impugning the people in China or Asian Americans. Like, having this discussion does not mean we're in any way like endorsing any kind of hate crimes. Asian Americans help build this country. They're as much a part of this country as are the Chinese people. We're talking about science here, and not reactionary xenophobia. I just want to make that
Right.
point.
Yeah,
The
absolutely. And also
the
the Chinese people have also been victims of this
Exactly.
regime and its actions, and in fact are still currently under that victimhood. So this is in no way should be construed as us suggesting that that the studies or anything suggests that this has anything to do with people of Asian American origin or Asian origin, because it just is not the case. This is about the regime in China. It is about Xi and the Beijing regime, and that's the only people you could really look at in terms of these studies and ascribe any blame. Nick, you missed some of that, but I want you to jump in with whatever you were able to hear. Are you there?
Look, I entirely agree. I mean, it was Chinese scientists who originally actually said this may have been a lab leak. It was Chinese doctors who tried to alert the world that, there was a serious pandemic on. And the sad thing is the guy who blew the whistle died of COVID as a young ophthalmologist after having been suppressed and hauled in and locked up by the Chinese authorities. I mean, they've now made him a hero, posthumously, because they had to, because the Chinese people were incensed by this. But, the politics remains the same. And so, of course, they're trying to change the narrative. But, there are enormous number of fabulous doctors and scientists in China who I'm sure are equally concerned about how this virus came about. The question is, do they have a voice?
Right.
Under the current system. So yes, this shouldn't be anything about, xenophobia against, the Chinese people. They're a fabulous people and they're part of the world community, but we still need to get to the bottom of how this all happened. How do we avoid it happening again?
What do you make of the idea that this, they described that they did not investigate any bioengineering or any deliberate bioengineering of the coronavirus? And we spoke a little bit while you were off there about, that it's not unusual for countries to have biowarfare. Yes, everyone's leaning towards this idea that it might be accidental, but what if it wasn't accidental? What if it was a bioengineering event? Is it possible that that's what it was? Is that still likely out there?
Yes, look, I think we have to separate bioengineering from bioweapons.
Right, okay.
Everything we do in our lab and every other lab in the world now is bioengineering.
Right.
All our vaccines are created by bioengineering. It's one of the fabulous breakthroughs, of the 20th century, is our ability to manipulate the genomes, whether it's of a virus or making a drug or a vaccine. So bioengineering is legitimate. We shouldn't in any way infringe or restrict that, because that's where all the great drugs of the future are going to come from, like gene therapy. It's a revolution and it's amazingly positive. As I think Nina was pointing out, I mean, science is going to deliver, amazing things going forward. And we shouldn't, sort of block science and go back to the caves. I mean, that is not the
no one's
solution
suggesting that
to this or to global warming or anything. No, but, because I think there is an ideology out there that, science has created these problems and therefore let's shut down science. And there is a large anti-science community, let's be honest, in the United States particularly. And unfortunately, the previous president seemed to give encouragement to those anti-scientists. So we don't want to turn this into an anti-science debate. And I think Nina rightly pointed out, science provides the solutions. Occasionally, science will take, something will go wrong, yes, we need to try and reduce the risk of that, but we can't totally avoid it, but we have to manage it. But we shouldn't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, science is essential to humanity going forward. We should encourage it. But yes, when it goes wrong, we should be honest and admit to it. But as I say, not allow that to encourage people who are anti-science or anti-vaccines or, anti-everything else, that just feeds the wrong, I guess, message out there. So,
right.
yes.
What about the deliberate release part of it? What about the fact
that
this
it's a
could
really
have been
difficult discussion.
Yeah. But what about is it possible that this thing is a bioweapon, or was deliberately released, I should say? Maybe that's a better way of discussing it.
There's no way to know, but I would say I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I don't think you should even go there. I think that's
well. I mean, why not?
That's why. Well, that's why the Trump. That's why people wouldn't talk about this during that period, because that's what they were. They were afraid of.
I understand what you're saying, but I just want to know if it's within the realm of possibilities from the science that we've assessed so far. Is a bioweapon still a possibility, and is a deliberate release still a possibility in the science as you see it?
No.
No. Okay.
No, absolutely
it would seem like a pretty self-defeating move.
I mean, presumably, if you were caught, yes, but let's just we'll leave it at that. That's fine. All right.
There's so many things about this that says that if someone did it in that, they weren't very competent.
Right.
It's not designed in a way that would function as a bioweapon. It's terrible, but it doesn't kill everyone. And of course, if you're going to release it, you'd have a vaccine and you'd immunize your whole population before you released such a monster. So no, I think we can totally discredit that possibility.
Interesting. Any other questions from Nick, from Noel, or from Nina? Nina, you guys want to jump in?
I don't. Well, I mean, I don't think. I guess I would ask, what do you think is the likelihood, Nick, that we find out given the atmosphere that you see in the science world, that we find out, or that more scientists start to come together behind you and people like David Relman at Stanford? Do you think that there will come a consensus? I mean, are you sensing that among your colleagues, that there will come a consensus where people will begin to say, let's talk about this?
Look, absolutely. I think, it was very tough last year to talk about this, and there was a lot of pushback. I think as time has gone by, and more scientists have joined in from all around the world. We now talk regularly to people in Europe, the US, Hong Kong. I mean, even people in China. So I think that, yes, more and more people will be brave and will look at the data and make their own conclusions, which I think, there is a lot of evidence out there if people want to see it as to why it might be a lab leak. Similarly, I think I think this would bring down the Chinese regime. They have an amazing ability. If they sense the writings on the wall and the global science community is going to come out with a consensus that this really was a lab leak, then the central government, just as they did with the suppression of the information at the beginning of this pandemic, they just sacked the local officials and held them accountable. And similarly, they would take fairly extreme action against the local people involved and absolve themselves of knowledge or responsibility. So I think they've shown that they can actually admit to an error and wear it and get away with it in that sense. So I think if they do sense the scientific community has moved, very much in that direction and they can't really hold ground against it, I'm confident the Chinese government will actually flip. And again, in their discussions, they've never excluded the possibility themselves. So when you look at the fine print, they've always left it there as the lab leak. They're not saying remove that completely. I think they're leaving themselves an out there if they have to.
I think that's very astute, and I think that's exactly what we might see at the end of the day. Is because the scientific community has shifted. I mean, it's clear just in the since May last year when I first published my story and did my podcast to now, we've seen a giant shift in this possibility, and certainly the Biden government has not disputed any of this. I mean, it's not like they came out and said, oh, what Trump was saying was nonsense. In fact, they've done essentially the opposite by not disputing anything. There was a big fact sheet that came out from the State Department in the last week of the Trump administration, which laid out all these facts, and people sort of disputed it because it was the Trump administration. But, the Biden administration has not come out and said that is wrong or incorrect. In fact, by their silence, they're sort of saying it is correct. And then we also saw Blinken, the foreign secretary, Secretary of State, also say that, he has some concerns about the methodology of the WHO study. And then we heard the White House also say that they had asked for some rewriting of this WHO report, which means there is a giant shift going on. So really, it's now in China's court. Are they going to act in this way you've suggested, where they say, yes, well, we were wrong. Maybe there was something we've discovered since, and it was a lab leak. Now, that does not, help them. Maybe domestically they can control that. In terms of their foreign expansion, it's certainly, and their new influence campaign, to influence the world, it would certainly take away from all of that, because they've been using the vaccinations and other responses to the coronavirus as a way to influence, boost themselves around the world. That would have to go. I mean, that's clearly would hurt them on a foreign relations kind of way. But in terms of the domestic crowd, they could manage it that way. They could manage it by saying, we've discovered something and we now know that it was a leak. That's certainly a possibility. Nina, any thoughts on that?
Well, I agree. I mean, I was just watching the Adam Curtis documentaries. I don't know if anybody has seen any of them. They're amazing. I can't get you out of my head. This amazing BBC footage that he weaves together. And a lot of it is in China during the Cultural Revolution. I highly recommend people watch this. It's mesmerizing about our recent history as humans on this planet. But there's a lot of, the Chinese the government was in the 1960s was, innocent people were trotted out and sent to jail. I mean, this is how it works. I mean, people disappear. I mean, there's Wen Liang, who was the guy you talked about who died, the ophthalmologist who was the whistleblower in that hospital in Wuhan who died, was actually tipped off to the problem by an earlier WeChat conversation by a woman, the head of the ER department in Wuhan, named Ai Fen. And Ai Fen, when, the second or third month of the pandemic, was interviewed by China's version of People magazine, who knew that they had something like that. And she told this story of how she started to notice, this is very, very contagious. And within a week, that the doctors were getting sick and the nurses were falling. And she put out on WeChat to her colleagues, this looks like SARS and it looks a lot more dangerous. The next morning, she came into work and they said that she was called into the office and told, don't ever put that onto WeChat. You're making us look bad. You're making your city look bad. And furthermore, keep your mouth shut and put your head down and keep working. And then she went on in silence. And this Wen Liang is the one who then took that and went out with it further. She wrote this piece, ran in whatever this version of People magazine is. It was immediately taken down by the Chinese government, and the Chinese people tried to get around it, translated it into all of these obscure languages, including some language from Lord of the Rings or something. I mean, unbelievable. And it has been it was printed in Harper's Quarterly. What, not Harper's, Lewis Lapham's Quarterly. Yeah, they printed it in full last summer, so you can still see it, but it's not online, as far as I know. It's but her, those are the lengths that the Chinese people will go towards trying to get their own story out. And this woman has been silenced. I mean, she's not been seen since. So I agree. I think that they would, if they had to, they would just trot some people out and say, you did this terrible mistake. Shame on you, shame on your family, shame on your ancestors, or whatever it is, and that's it. And then they would attempt to go forward. I don't know if there would be some kind of, I don't know enough about Chinese politics to know, or the society. I'm not whether there would be a kind of a response and a rebellion against that government. I don't know. They have, one of the things I write about is the reason that they were so effective in controlling their pandemic is that they used this biosurveillance gear that we would we don't, if we saw it here, we would freak out. I mean, people ripping their masks off and punching Walmart managers over masks. If they saw cops coming to them they had these glasses that could sort of identify somebody's history and could tell. They had drones taking people's temperature. You couldn't leave your house without checking in and out with your phone. They knew where everyone was. All of this technology is available, and they were using it and applying it to their population. So it really is a very futuristic kind of dystopian place. Not saying that we're not doing, I mean, we are doing surveillance, surveillance capitalism, where every single day, every man, woman, and child in America has 50,000 data points for sale every year. And from Snowden that the national security state can dip into that stream whenever they want to. We're just as surveilled in a different way. But in America, it's rip the mask off. I want liberation. Nobody's even talking about this other aspect.
Well, the
that's
surveillance is a big issue. It's another day. We'll do that.
That's another
certainly
story.
the passports are beginning to show their face here, and that's going to be a big issue. Nick Petrovsky from Flinders University in Adelaide, I want to thank you so much for your persistence in doing this research and sticking with it. I mean, it takes a lot. It takes a lot to resist the efforts of the entire scientific community. And I gather, journal after journal, which turned you down for whatever reason. And still to this day, I was still questioning it. But it seems like it's not only thorough, but actually the most accurate of all the attempts to identify what the origin of the virus was. So thank you so much for sticking with that. That's an incredible testament to who you are and your work.
It's a pleasure.
And thank you very much for being with us tonight. It's been a really interesting almost hour and a half now. If either Noel or Nina want to stick around, feel free to. I want to thank Nick so much for your time. And we'll be chatting a little bit longer here. But we also should tell people where they can find you're on Twitter. It's what's your Twitter handle?
So Vaccine News.
With an underscore.
With an underscore between
so
the vaccine and the news. And it's a VAX rather than VACC.
All right. So it's at VAXINE_news. Okay. Cool. We'll make sure we do that. We'll mention that on the story when we post this podcast. But thank you so much for being here, Nick, and have a good day, I guess, in Australia.
It's a real pleasure. Yeah.
Okay.
Lovely
Cheers.
to meet you, Nina and Noel. And
Likewise.
Thanks, Seb.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much. Really
Cheers.
appreciate your time. Cheers.
Thank you.
So now we can get back to the breaking news of, did you see this? Matt
Well,
Gaetz.
no, go ahead. Oh, Matt Gaetz.
Yates, sorry.
Yeah.
This is Wall Street Journal breaking news. Under investigation for alleged sexual relationship with underage girl. DOJ has been probing him since last year.
Wow. I'd read that on the way up to the show, and then I was so focused on the show, I didn't get all the details, but wow.
There's always an
there's that whole
underage girl.
adoption thing, right? That he's adopted a son, which seems very unusual as well. I'm not sure what that's all about, but there's, that's been rumored around. So earlier on, he was just resigning. He didn't think he was going to, not resigning, he wasn't going to run again. But now we know why.
Right, exactly. He was going to leave early and go to Newsmax because he'd already been talking to DOJ because he was a person of interest in this investigation for hooking up with a 17-year-old girl. And what his mistake, it's always a mistake. Let me word that better. But what he did is he took her over state lines and paid her.
Whoops.
He gave her a job. So that's sex trafficking. That's
that
actually
sure is.
very
that is sex
serious.
Trafficking.
And so
they never
he
learn.
was trying
right?
to get out of there.
Wow. I wonder if Newsmax will still hire him now that that's made public. In fact, he'll even maybe not be able to make it to Newsmax because that's a very serious offense. Do you guys know about this, the adopted son that he has? Have you seen much about that? Yeah. Do you know much about him? I mean, that seems also unusual. I don't, it seems like an unusual, very, very unusual thing for a representative for at least the GOP to do. But these days, apparently, you can do anything and still be in the GOP. I mean, just look at the former guy, as you were calling him earlier, Anita.
I don't know anything about this. Is it like a Russian kid, or is he single? He's got it. What is that? What's the deal?
He's a Cuban kid who has a father in Miami. Okay, but Nestor at one point called him an assistant and had him working in his congressional office, but then came out last year and bizarrely said, "I have a son." Mm-hmm. So he uses him in these like press gaggles and says, "I have a son," but the guy has a father and he's like 19, and at one point he was like Nestor's, intern, like he paid him, you know? So, and he lives with Nestor, and Nestor now calls him his son, and he's this, you know, young Cuban boy. It's the kind of thing, like if you scratch the surface on Matt Gaetz, it's so like bizarre and abhorrent. He wouldn't have existed in any other time but now, you know? And
exactly.
he retweets me. He retweets me
Really?
sometimes, which is just creepy. Like I'll make fun of him and he'll retweet me, which is just like, oh.
He also supports Britney Spears, by the way.
He knows that. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Nina, I know you probably have to run, but I did want to talk a little bit more about your book because Noel's read a lot more than I have because I was reading so much about the other stuff.
I'll hang around for that.
But yeah, just tell us a little bit more about this book. It sounds fascinating. It sounds like you run the whole gamut.
Yeah, well, a publisher called me in December, early December, and said, can you write a book about the race to the vaccine and have it done by the end of March or beginning of March? And I thought, well, this is intriguing. It'd have to be short, but I'm really interested in not just the race to the vaccine, which at the time I didn't really know much about anyway, but the appalling mishandling, politicization of science in the last guy's regime and what happened to the CDC under that administration. And because I've covered them for a long time, I understood what the two pillars of his power were, which is this sort of right-wing, no, I shouldn't say right-wing, sorry, free market, unleashed free market principles, ideology on one side, and then the white evangelical Christians on the other side. And those were his two poles of power. And so I identify in this first
You leave out
chapter,
Russia, but you should leave out Russia.
No, I'm not going into Russia. I don't go there with you on this one.
That's okay.
It's these two American, and the way how they handled the pandemic has everything to do with that. They staff these public health agencies at the federal level with moralizing right-wing Christians. Pence's people were. This was the payback to the evangelicals. They would give them, HHS. They get control over CDC. They can get rid of things like, reproductive rights website that is linked to the CDC. They're completely obsessed with, LGBTQ stuff. And then the big advance at the HHS was putting a button on their website saying, if you press this button if you have any religious liberty problems. In other words, if you're a pharmacist who doesn't want to sell contraceptives, or if you're a doctor who doesn't want to work with a transgender person, press this button. And they were going to put the force of the federal legal system behind them. It's disgusting. They put all of their effort into that and were flat-footed on. They weren't paying attention to a possible deadly virus coming in, because this is how they thought of public health, as a gift to this group. And then on the other side,
that's the reason. Oh, I want to let you finish.
That's one part of it. And then the other side, and this is where it's the Jared Kushner MBA mentality, where everything was reduced to whether it could be to supply and demand, and to the laws of the fittest and the laws of the jungle. And that's why they said, right after when in his first conversation with the governors after the lockdown, he said, "I'm behind you all the way, but you'll have to get your own stuff." And also, price is always an issue. Because the governors are like, why don't we have a sole purchaser? A sole purchaser would force the suppliers to bargain to lower their prices. No, they don't want that, because their mentality is, you get as much money as you possibly can for something, or you're a chump. That's the mentality of that last regime. That was the bottom line. It was always about.
It was about the money.
Absolutely Hobbesian universe of the weak and the strong. And in this instance, it played out with a eugenic effect. I mean, that's the ultimate. The Mercer ideology, the Mercer donor ideology, taken to its furthest extent, is a eugenic ideology. It says any kind of assistance, including education, including medical care to the poor and the frail, weakens the herd of the white American powerful, landowner. And this is their mentality. And so that was one side of the response, and the other side was the payback to the Christians. And by the way, at Redfield and Burks, they're evangelical Christians. Nobody pays attention to that. Alex Azar brought crazy Ralph Drollinger into the White House. He was his sponsor for Capital Ministries, for prayer meetings inside the White House. Unheard of. The founders of this country are rolling in their graves. They were bringing this guy in, prosperity gospelier, to hold cabinet prayer meetings in the White House. Alex Azar, our HHS at the time, HHS secretary, that's what they were focused on.
Yep. Yeah.
That's
look,
just
certainly
one
when you
part
layer
of my
when
book.
you
That's
when you
just
layer
one
the whole
part.
coronavirus virus over the eugenics thing, it's also kind of challenging and really controversial. But we'll talk about that on another day. The book is interesting. It'll be out in May on the 18th, my mother's birthday. So it's going to be amazing. And it's called Virus, Vaccinations, the CDC, and the Hijacking of America's Response to the Pandemic. And the good news is you can pre-order it right now. I know I have. I did it on Amazon, and I'm sure you can do it on any of your favorite booksellers online. Please buy it because Nina's fantastic, but also it sounds like an amazing read. Thanks, Nina. Thanks for joining us. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No worries. It's down to just the two of us now, Noel. I felt like I didn't give you enough time to jump in with questions during that interview, but wasn't that fascinating? I thought he was, just blew my mind. When I first read about his research, I was like, I cannot believe that this has been suppressed because the research seems so sound. And now when you look at it in context of what the WHO has said, well, are they, and the questions around that whole investigation, it seems like he knew all along. He was right all along, and he was the whistleblower. And not so much a whistleblower because he wasn't on the inside, but his study was the first to reveal that, and he was suppressed, which is just unbelievable.
Absolutely, and like the case that he lays out is the only way it could have happened. If you really look at this science and the circumstance, there really is no other explanation than the one he makes. Right. And Nina gets into this in her book. Like science circled the wagons. The researchers of virologists around the world were like, we can't let people think this came from a lab, or we'll never work again. Our research will never get funded. So it wasn't just the Chinese government trying to hide it. It was the establishment of science being like, this truth is too dangerous.
It's too dangerous, but it seems to me that this is even more dangerous. Not telling people about it and then it being exposed is the worst case scenario for all scientists. I mean, this is now, if in fact it is definitively proved, and it certainly looks like we're heading in that direction, boy, that becomes difficult for scientists. Why were they hiding this for so long? Why?
I know.
It's worse than the other scenario,
It was two factors. And again, I'm not trying to keep plugging her book, but Nina gets into this really brilliantly because it was, at the same time the virus was spreading, you had Trump manipulating all this misinformation and these like idiots believing these conspiracy theories. And the truth was so close to a conspiracy theory. And like she talked about tonight, we are a nation that had secret labs and all this kind of stuff, So it was almost like the boy who cried wolf scenario.
It's kind of brilliant as a strategy for them. If they were in fact trying to hide something, the idea of going out there and saying it was China was a brilliant strategy. And at the time I noted, because it was kind of clear that what they were doing was baiting the Democrats, because it was during the elections. They were baiting the Democrats into taking an anti-Chinese position. A pro-Chinese position, because they were taking the anti-Chinese position, which would have been devastating for the Biden campaign and the Democrats because of the whole HUD to Biden thing. So it was really smart of the Democrats to actually not fall for that, but also smart of the Trump strategists to think, well, we can go here and either we'll bait them into this position, which will be helpful to us, or we can go here and no one will touch it.
Absolutely. And that's as much a part of this story. It's not just the virus and where it was made in China. It's the Trump administration's reaction to it and how that weaponized this pandemic in a way that made the whole thing so much more deadly,
Absolutely.
and now makes science, in jeopardy. It's literally like he screwed things up so bad that actual scientific research is in jeopardy. And a guy like this is an outlier, like Nick, he's a rebel. I mean, that guy clearly knows what he's talking about. He's clearly not blaming anybody in China. He's saying it was an accident. He says there's no way it was a bioweapon. It happens, some petri dish, something got in somebody's eye. They left the lab that day without being fully decontaminated, and boom.
Yep.
It's there,
Sure,
in the
of
world.
course it happens. It's happened. There's been
Right.
accidental SARS releases twice in the past in China. It's not.
Right.
It happens. Of course it does. It's just the cover up was so horrendous, and the cover up both in Wuhan was severe enough because that let the virus spread around the world. But then it got to America, and then Donald Trump went on his crazy, I don't know, disinformation campaign, whatever it was, telling people, don't worry, this is not going to be a problem. It'll get solved really quickly. When in that, I called it 19 days. Other people have called it 30 days. Where in that month, we went from, 1,000 cases to like 100,000 cases and was impossible to contain. So these two leaders, potentially, Xi and Trump, were the reason this virus contaminated the world, not because they conspired to release it, but because they failed to tell people what was going on, because they were, in fact, we know this, covering up what was going on. So, it certainly is. I mean, you can't think of a more horrific crime to ever have happened in the world. I mean, we don't know anything like this that has killed 2.7 million people because of two men's inaction or inability to tell the truth. I mean, that's a pretty significant event. And I know people are trying to avoid going there, but I'm going there because that's where you land up.
Well, you can't not go there. Trump sat there a year ago at the CDC and gave this press conference and said, tell them about the 4 million tests.
Right.
There was no 4 million tests.
Right.
We had tested 500 people at that point in time.
Yeah.
The thing was spreading like wildfire. He had a cruise ship infected with people, and he's like, I don't want to let them off the ship because it'll push up the numbers. Trump is incapable of thinking about anything but himself. And that was where that psychosis of his, that criminal negligence of being so self-centered, dovetailed with the perfect storm of a virus that the only way to combat it was to be transparent and honest. And he couldn't do that as a human being.
So here he is lying, Xi lying, and then now the world is dealing with the worst health pandemic, but also an incredible economic crisis that is really going to damage us of going forward. It is interesting to me that the Biden administration has said many times, and Biden is clearly on the record as saying they're going to let science lead the way now. This administration is firstly pro-science. Now, if science is not telling us the truth, we better know about it. And if the Biden administration knows that science isn't telling us the truth because they have information or science, we have to know about it, whether they're backing science or not. We need to know the facts. The facts are important here for all of us. I mean, the implications of something like this are unbelievable when you think about the war we're going through right now in terms of the balance of power in the world. You've got, China really trying to ascend. They're doing things globally to hurt the United States, to make sure that they're the leading world superpower. Something like this is going to really damage their reputation, obviously, and obviously it's factoring into how they think about this. But it could mean the difference between being the world's biggest superpower and being number 2 again.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, you hinted at it before, or Biden hinted at it as well. He said, I have my theories on how it got out. I'm going to wait to speak on it, but I have my idea, so let's hope that there is some science and transparency. And so, as Nina said, more and more scientists are starting to talk about the reality of it, because none of that other data adds up, as we just went through for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And here's your smoking gun. They deleted all the, COVID bat research.
Yeah.
They had 10,000
Exactly.
cases of this, and they erase the files.
Yeah.
You only do that if you're guilty. You destroy evidence if you think there's going to be an investation.
It took them a year to get any scientists in there, any independent scientists in there. I mean, just think about that, a year to get people even to visit. They've locked up their borders. They haven't allowed people to travel. It's clearly suggestive that they're covering up something, or they would have looked for the world to help them. And, as you were pointing out, I didn't get to go through all this evidence here, but I'll show it to you quickly. When they tested all these animals, and they tested a lot of animals, none of these animals tests showed up with any coronavirus. So it's not coming from an animal in any likelihood. They've tested everything. So, so where's it coming from? It's coming from the only other logical place which could possibly come from, which is a lab, because really that's the lab that studied this bat coronavirus. It's so kind of obvious that it's difficult for people for people to understand that this could be a cover-up in this case, because you think that they would just say, well, of course, yes, we made a mistake, but they're still persisting. And I do want to underline what you said earlier, which I think, Noel, was so astute and important, because we just saw another case today where there was another attack on an Asian American woman in New York City. None of this is reflective of what the Chinese people have undergone or have had to deal with, nor is it any responsibility of any Asian American. It just makes absolutely no sense to criticize them for this, because it's got nothing to do with them. This is squarely looking at the Beijing government, the government of the Communist Party of China, which is Xi Jinping's party. That's what you've got to look at. You can't really extrapolate from this that any person of Asian American origin is in any way responsible for this coronavirus. It just is not the case. So people have to be very careful, and we all have to be careful in our day-to-day lives when people bring that up, to make sure that we're firstly clarifying them and correcting them, but also make sure we're very specific in the language we use in terms of who's to blame. I'm sorry, I'm still on the slide. I thought I was on camera, but there you go. We need to be specific about the language. We should not talk about the Chinese in general. We're talking about the Beijing government or the Chinese government, or Xi specifically, which I think had some sort of involvement in handling this. But it's really important for everyone to be careful about the language you're using on this, because, as we've seen even today, another attack on an Asian American person, which is just, it breaks your heart, because so many Asian Americans have fought for freedom in this country, have been loyal and patriotic citizens, and there's absolutely no reason that they should be victims of this at all. They're just not at all, and they deserve everyone's support.
Well said.
Thank you, sir. You said it first. And let's leave it for tonight. This is the longest show we've ever done. We almost said, no, actually, I was trying to, just for the fun of it, see if we can get to 2 hours, but we're close. Noel, I look forward to you being my dance partner, as it were. This week was a busy show because we had so much commentary from Nick and Nina, but next week we'll have lots more time to dig into stuff, and you'll be here every Tuesday. But you also have a new podcast. So why don't you tell folks about your new podcast?
Yeah, I just launched a podcast. I launched it yesterday. There's 4 episodes up wherever you get your podcasts, the Noel Casler podcast. It's my rant. As you can tell, I like to talk. So
oh my gosh, that's my favorite.
He's working with me, and I just go through the day's headlines and I let him rip, and I put in a few anecdotes from my life in entertainment for 25 years. So check it out.
I am really excited about that, and I hope you will one day do it here on Narativ TV so we can share it with viewers in full camera mode, because it sounds terrific, and I'm looking forward to listening to it too. I haven't yet.
Thank you.
But I will. That's our show for tonight. Thank you very much for watching Narativ. We'll be back Friday, I think, with the after show. I think there may be a possibility we won't do one this week, but we'll get back to you about that. Check out the Narativ TV Twitter feed for information on that. And that's all we've got for you for tonight. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll see you again soon. Have a good night, everybody. Narativ is funded by viewers like you. Support our independent journalism at patreon.com/Narativ.